So, what the hell? This is a difficult question with a lot of complicated, multifaceted answers. Let's start with the facts. The story of Korekiyo Shinguji. And before we get into this, I would like to clarify right now that I am first going to present this information as given by the narrative and by Korekiyo, and will save all judgment, analysis, opinions, questions, and other similar matters until after I have run through the information. He's the ultimate anthropologist, specifically a cultural anthropologist. His role within V3 is basically non-existent. He makes reasonable arguments in trial sometimes, and otherwise he's just kind of generally off-putting. He's notably not disturbed by the whole murder thing, but otherwise he seems pretty harmless. And then Chapter 3 happens, and hey, weird how Korekiyo is getting attention now.
For the uninitiated, Danganronpa is a franchise mainly consisting of visual novels, wherein 16 high school students are trapped by Monokuma and can only leave by graduating, which involves killing someone and not getting caught, which is determined by a class trial followed by a vote. If everyone votes for the right person, the murderer is executed, but if they vote for the wrong one, everyone but the murderer is executed. Also, all of the characters have talents, making them ultimates at something, but honestly this has very little relevancy in V3, so don't worry about it if you don't get it. V3 is the most recent of these games, and the most popular, owing both to its recency and the fact it's largely standalone. And also, people like it, I guess.
In this chapter, Angie is murdered by Korekiyo when she walks in on him setting up a murder trap using a seance ritual. He creates an untraceable murder scene that would easily allow him to graduate and leave the school if he just didn't have to use this sick fucking seance seesaw murder trick to murk Tenko, which is his literal, actual reason for going through with it. Side note already this early on, sorry, but man, can we talk about how much the writers just blatantly gave up in this chapter? Are we going to see the double murder format used to create interesting conflict in the story by having a murderer living amongst the rest of the cast? Nope, he's responsible for both and gets killed anyway, despite the game spending so much time on teasing this one little plot point. Which can't be called an interesting subversion when it's just the same thing they did the last few times. Hey, what's the murderer's motive gonna be? Man, what do you mean motive? This dude fucks his sister. Who gives a shit what the motive is? Let's just spend several hours having characters conflict over this Necronomicon shit that resolves in nothing and amounts to little more than a clue in a trial. They couldn't even be fucked to pretend they cared about their whole overarching theme in this chapter. Like, every chapter leans into this idea of having to uncover a terrible truth, one that makes the living players regret having to vote the blackened off. For Kaede, it's because she's been a leader figure and she was only trying to get rid of the mastermind for everyone else's sake. For Kirumi, it's because everyone somehow believes a high schooler would be a good prime minister. For Gonta, it's because he's such a nice, genuine guy and can't even remember the murder he committed. And for Kaito, it's because they realized too late they revealed the story behind his and Kokichi's plan to mess with the mastermind. And for Chapter 6, it's... God, I don't even have time to dissect all of that. But for Chapter 3, they don't even bother with it. Everyone's just like, yeah, okay, Korekiyo did it, I'm okay with this. Like, obviously they're upset and uncomfortable with the truth, but it's not like the other chapters. If anything, they want Korekiyo dead. And, like, they really could have just had someone else murder Angie, because then that would have worked so well with the theme. Oh my fucking god. It wouldn't have even been hard to just reframe his story a little in order to make it meet the theme, but honestly, I think the writing team just genuinely disliked Korekiyo so much that they squandered every interesting thing they could have done in this chapter just to have him dead. Anyway, rant over. So, what was that thing I said about him banging his sister? Once Korekiyo gets cornered, he begins to have a serious meltdown, and it is during that he reveals what's under the mask, which is just his face but with lipstick. Oh, the horror. When the mask is down, he begins to speak to himself as another person who speaks gently to him and encourages him, though, we'll dissect her dialogue more thoroughly later. This motivates him to keep up the argument despite his own obvious distress, and it also freaks out everyone in the room. Side note, again, but like, I don't know for sure if what's going on with Korekiyo is true dissociative identity disorder, a coping mechanism that looks like dissociative identity disorder, or the possession that he claims it is. But can we please stop with this tired trope of using dissociative identity disorder to have an evil personality or otherwise make a person seem more creepy or unstable or I don't know, any of that? I've met a lot of people with dissociative identity disorder, and, like, first of all, absolutely none of them, host or alter, have ever done anything to make me feel concerned for the safety of myself or other people, or even, like, feel uncomfortable. They're just normal people. This is only a stereotype that makes people with dissociative identity disorder look a lot scarier than they are in reality. Second of all, there are just other things you can do narratively with dissociative identity disorder that isn't the same tired song and dance. Anyway, once the trial is said and done, Korekiyo says he murdered because he wanted his sister, who died of illness and never had many friends due to her constantly being in and out of the hospital, to have friends in the afterlife by way of murdering 100 girls. Additionally, he believes himself to be harboring his sister's spirit, hence explaining this other person living within him that speaks to him, though other characters suggest this is merely a delusion. Also, he has sex with his sister. His words, not mine. Or, well, did. Or maybe still does. I don't know where being possibly possessed by your sister lover falls on the scale of masturbation to sex to unresolved rape trauma, and we're just gonna breeze past that sentence like it's nothing. Despite Korekiyo's earlier distress, he accepts his execution calmly, regretful that he didn't quite reach his goal of murdering 100 girls, but is happy to be reunited with his sister. His last words are to let the survivors know that both he and his sister will be watching them over as spirits. Though I guess that didn't work out for him. Honestly, I don't know what the fuck is happening here, but it does seem kind of harsh coming from a mass murderer and his own sister lover. So, what the hell? I guess I should get this out of the way and say I think the implications of the relationship between Korekiyo and his sister are a lot more troubling than either he or the narrative would like to admit. That thought is, in fact, what inspired this whole video. I have never liked the way Korekiyo's story was written, and at first I had assumed it was because I saw the whole incest thing as nothing more than a lazy shock value plot twist, and to be perfectly clear, it is definitely that. But in time I have realized that my issue with all of the writing decisions that compounded into the character of Korekiyo Shinguji lies mainly on the framing. Within every narrative, there is content and framing. The content is pure information. What do characters say and do? What happens in the story? All of that kind of stuff. Then there is the framing, which is essentially the way the content is presented in order to elicit specific intellectual or emotional responses in the audience. And to be clear, framing is not inherently a manipulative or deceptive tool used to trick the audience in some way or make them think something that they wouldn't think otherwise. Audiences disagree with the way a work frames its content all the time. As an example, take the meme of people making fun of the power of friendship narratives. These works might frame their message as genuine, but most audiences don't really buy it, and even when they do, it's kind of in like a, this is cheesy but I enjoy it way. Rather, framing is more revealing of what a writer wants an audience to think or feel about something. As an example, let's dissect my own introduction. So in my introduction, I explicitly say that I will present the narrative of Korekiyo as given by the game without my own opinions or judgment. But this is not completely true. Even if we're ignoring my side notes that are full of opinion and judgment, there are moments where I say something in order to inspire a specific intellectual or emotional response. While I do think my summary is factually accurate, it's also true that I do allow my own opinions and thoughts to frame those facts. For example, this sentence. He creates an untraceable murder scene that would easily allow him to graduate and leave the school if he didn't just have to use this sick fucking seance seesaw murder trick to Mark Tango, which is his literal actual reason for going through with it. The information in this sentence is true, and I break my more academic tone in order to highlight the fact I think the murder trick itself is absurd, and I think it's kind of ridiculous that that's the best answer the writing team could come up with. Later in the introduction, I say this. Also, he has sex with his sister. His words, not mine. Or, well, did. Or maybe still does, I don't know, where being possibly possessed by your sister lover falls on the scale of masturbation to sex to unresolved rape trauma. And we're just going to breeze past that sentence like it's nothing. First of all, that is deliberate. I wrote that into the script, as it serves the dual role of establishing discomfort while at the same time softening the blow. I then immediately followed up with his words not mine, because even though I had already established I was presenting his story as he describes it, I still felt it important to emphasize that I do not necessarily agree with the idea that his relationship with his sister was wholly consensual on his part, and thus don't wish to imply it. The rest of this excerpt is a little harder to explain in terms of my intentions of the feelings I was trying to communicate. I think this one part, I don't know where being possibly possessed by your sister lover falls on the scale of masturbation to sex to unresolved rape trauma, is a culmination of my distress caused by the general absurdity of the whole situation, discomfort with the subject matter, and my own frustration with basically everything about how this plot point is written, and I allowed myself a moment to express those feelings in my summary. The following sentence was born from the fact I felt I couldn't just say that without acknowledging that there's something deeply troubling within it, but I didn't have the time to break it down without completely losing focus. In all of the examples I gave, I never stated my own feelings or opinions outright, nor how I wanted the audience to think or feel, but it can still be felt and seen if you know what you're looking for. This is what I mean by framing. And again, I would refrain from calling this manipulative. For one, the thoughts and feelings I express are very genuine, and just because they are genuine to me and not stated bluntly doesn't mean I'm tricking people into agreeing with me. I think most people agree that his storyline is absurd and he as a character is horrifying, even if we don't all agree on the exact reason why. People will naturally notice the points where they don't agree with an opinion or feeling I presented. For example, I'm sure I lost a lot of people when I pulled out the phrase unresolved rape trauma, since while I consider this to be so self-evident that I would be willing to present it as fact, it is not widely accepted by the fan base that rape or abuse has any part of Korekiyo's backstory. And to be clear, I don't blame people for thinking this. After all, the game itself never says or implies anything to that effect. Korekiyo does not say or imply anything to that effect. And if anything, Korekiyo is framed as the dangerous sex criminal in all of this. I will admit that the grounds for my argument, the reading of Korekiyo as an abuse victim with some gnarly trauma responses, are a lot more shaky than those of the argument for reading Korekiyo as a genuinely evil person. And I do believe that the game wants the audience to agree with that second reading. It is only in questioning the grounds of the game's framing that I saw this other way of reading Korekiyo's character, and considering all the psychic damage I had to take by rewatching 3 chapters worth of a game that I once claimed to hate, but upon reflection I actually mostly like it. It just made a few really bad choices that damaged the overall product. Because I just wanted to be that thorough in my analysis of this character, I want to explain why I dislike and disagree with the framing of Korekiyo's narrative. So, here's a question. Why? Why should I even bother? Why do I want to put myself into the line of fire for the fucking incest guy? For the serial killer guy? For the irredeemable serial killer incest guy? So look, murder bad, obviously. If Korekiyo were a real human being, I would be perfectly fine with calling him a bad guy and leaving it at that. But this is not only fiction, but fucking Danganronpa. Not only are so many characters murderers, but almost all of them are treated sympathetically, even if their reasons for murder are bad. In fact, here's a list of every character who has canonically committed murder and yet are treated as good people, or at the bare minimum have their motives or backstory seen sympathetically. And just to be fair, I will only include characters who have killed outside of a killing game. Toko/Genocide Jack, 4 out of the 5 Warriors of Hope, Fuyuhiko and Peko, and also the entire SDR2 cast depending on how much you care about the stupid brainwashing plot twist. I hate Danganronpa 3, Ryoma, and Maki. So, Danganronpa as a franchise is not above viewing literal serial killers, mass murderers, and assassins with a sympathetic lens. So this left me wondering, why not Korekiyo? How come Korekiyo, specifically, is an exception? Is it because his reasons are flimsy? Sure, but so are Genocide Jack's, and not only is she framed as relatively harmless, but the abuse her host went through that created her is recognized for the horrible thing that it was. Is it because he feels no regret? Well, sure, but the same can probably be said true of Maki. She's still totally okay with murdering people, as evidenced by her suggesting she murder Anji in Chapter 3, as well as her later saying that she would be willing to kill the rest of the cast in Chapter 5 if they so desired. And even then, Korekiyo still very sincerely believes that death is not necessarily an end, but a transferal to the spirit world, so while that obviously is a dangerous thing for him to believe, and possibly untrue depending on where Danganronpa really wants to sit on the ghost existing or not idea, it does mean that he's remorseless, not because he just has that much contempt for human life or finds murder more rewarding than the lives of others, but because he doesn't believe he's causing his victims all that much harm in the long run. I'm not saying it's a good thing or that it makes him a good person, only that I think that's worth noting. Is it because of the incest thing? If we accept the idea the narrative suggests that both he and his sister were of sound mind and body when consenting to this relationship and absolutely no grooming or imbalanced power dynamics were involved, then yeah, that's pretty gross, I won't lie. But then that just means he had a normal romantic relationship that is coincidentally gross, but not really cause to list him as worse than other murderers in this series. And if their dynamics were unbalanced, then he's the younger one, so she's the one with the power over him. He's not doing anything morally bankrupt either way. Is it because he's being super villainized for being mentally ill? I mean, at least in spirit he is, if not actually, but again, Genocide Jack. Is it because he is, you know, wait, is it? Even amongst other male Danganronpa queers, he's the only one that's expressed himself in gender nonconforming ways, and in fact his femininity is a point of focus for other characters. Kaito even equates Korekiyo's interest in the occult, which Kaito finds terrifying, to acting girly. And like, I know I said, oh, the horror as a joke about him wearing makeup earlier, but isn't that kind of how it's treated in canon? Like, I know it's also the pseudo-DID thing that people think is scary for some reason, but the face reveal is basically a fucking jump scare. Well, okay, that is true. But I'm sure it's not the only reason, and certainly not the main one. Honestly, if there's any one single factor, it's probably the incest thing, if we're being real. And I guess on a somewhat related note, the game does treat him as a sort of sex freak. His interest in bondage and pain play is framed as disturbing, which exists in sharp contrast to the other highly sexual character in this game, Miyu, whose kinky sexual interests are only ever treated as funny. Additionally, the love hotel scene. Okay, so we could spend a very long time talking in circles about the ethics of fantasies involving rape or dubious consent, and no matter how you slice it, even under the most generous interpretation of the scene, the fantasy Korekiyo has does not involve Shuichi's full consent, and it definitely isn't informed, but at the same time it is not an act of rape that Korekiyo is actually committing, only a sexual fantasy of one. We have absolutely no way of knowing if it is something that he has done or ever would do in real life, so let's just leave it at this. Since there is no evidence of Korekiyo having ever actually committed an act of rape in real life, then I will chalk this up to only a fantasy of his. You can decide independently what having these fantasies means about him, but for the purposes of this video, I will not be drawing any conclusions about him concerning this fantasy. I really just don't have it in me to have a nuanced discussion about something that's only barely canon. I bring it up at all only because it is a very explicit instance of Korekiyo being portrayed as dangerous or creepy in a way that's related directly to his sexual interests. But hey, at least we can keep this conversation simple, since it's not like in Miyu's fantasy she also commits an act of rape, but it's played for laughs instead. Oh hey, look at that! I'm not getting into it. I will not do it. As far as I care, these fantasies have no bearing on the characters at large, so I am just going to ignore them. So any further points I make are not going to have these fantasies into account. My point in all of this is that Korekiyo is treated as scary for being into BDSM, while Miyu is treated as funny for being into BDSM. And the honest answer for why is probably that Miyu is a woman, so her being into niche sexual cultures is funny, while Korekiyo is a man, so him being into niche sexual cultures is a red flag. And hey, I love Miyu to death, but this is kind of weird, right? It's yet another instance where Korekiyo is framed as evil or wrong or bad, even amongst others of his own ilk. So I ask again, why is Korekiyo the irredeemable one? Of every Danganronpa character, the only ones who are framed as being even nearly as irredeemable as him are the people instigating the apocalypse, and the guy whose main personality trait is wanting to have sex with teenagers. And hey, let's just ignore that. Let's just ignore everything I just said here. How old was Korekiyo when his relationship with his sister started? He murdered nearly 100 people, and he's being very selective about who he murders. How long do you think that takes? How much longer when you consider he has to plan it so he doesn't get caught? Even if it only took a week each, it would still be almost 2 years. And how much longer when you consider he's doing research and fieldwork between all of this? He's got the time to spend memorizing a whole seance, so he's not half-assing his studies either. It's gotta be a handful of years, right? He's only a teenager right now, 18 at the very oldest. How old would you guess? It would probably have to be before he was even in high school, and how much older do you think his sister is than him? It's hard to say. I would personally say at least 4 years older, though I'll be the first to admit my reason for this is extremely anecdotal and personal to me and doesn't serve as an actual piece of evidence either way. In Korekiyo's third free time event, he mentions having read a book with his sister, implying they were reading concurrently. As I myself am an older sibling by 2 years, I would have found this awkward to do with my own sibling since we were basically peers. To me, this seems like something someone would do with their sibling if they were notably older than them. Again, not really evidence either way, just my own thoughts. I don't have answers to these questions, but they're troubling to consider since there's not really a good answer, just answers that are more or less scary. See, even in healthy sibling relationships, there is always a dynamic of power. In almost all circumstances, the older sibling serves as a caretaker for the younger. Older siblings provide guidance and assistance to the younger ones, and that role can be very easily manipulated. It's not hard at all to imagine Korekiyo's sister using her position and whatever number of years of wisdom and experience she has over him in order to manipulate him into the relationship or grooming him for it. This is why there are Danganronpa fans, including myself, who are quick to call the relationship between them abuse, even without knowing the particulars of their dynamic. Due to both age and a possibly manipulated sense of judgment, Korekiyo would have had no way to truly consent to such a thing. And if you keep all of that in mind when watching the third trial, it becomes upsetting in a totally new way. Korekiyo transforms from some freak into a deeply troubled individual. He's absolutely convinced of both the love and presence of his older sister and has become reliant on it. He admits himself that he nearly went mad after his sister's death, and I would argue that he did in some sense, having had to convince himself she still lives with him in order to cope with her loss. And need I remind you, the exact event that led to their supposed reunion was when Korekiyo was captured and tortured while on the job, which doubtlessly put him through an extreme amount of distress. So it's totally bizarre because these words on paper make it look very much as though Korekiyo is coping with a lot of horrible trauma that he contextualizes as good, beautiful things. And can you blame him? Has anything actually good ever happened to him? Logic dictates that he's been an abuse victim since a very young age and never had the resources to dig himself out of the mindset that left him in, so his only choices are to break down or embrace it. Even his field of study, something he does enjoy, is kind of tainted by the fact that according to his memory, he's been persecuted for being an ultimate and had to go into hiding. If all you've ever known in life is misery and pain, the ugliness lying in the human spirit, then maybe those things are just as beautiful as the things that actually feel good. And yet, despite it feeling so obvious to me, I feel like I'm just reading into irrelevant details and making up stories because this game just so obviously wants you to see him as nothing more than some freak, and it doesn't care about addressing any potential trauma that might be there one way or the other. The only time people talk to or about Korekiyo is to comment on how creepy he is or to respond to something they find off-putting about him, which kind of makes it sad when he's about to be executed and he's calling everybody his friends. Even his free time events are capped off with a foreshadowing note of horror rather than a moment of true, genuine friendship. There's no point where the narrative wants you to see Korekiyo as anything other than some kind of monster. And then there's the brief time where we actually get to see Korekiyo act out both his sister and his dynamic with her, which are presumably accurate to his memory. Admittedly, it's very little to go off of, but what definitely can be said is that his sister does an awful lot of talking down. Not necessarily in a negative way, though sometimes that, yes, but in the way that an older and more mature relative talks to a child. You mustn't raise your voice. You mustn't stutter. You mustn't lose composure. You mustn't become flustered. You mustn't waver. And remember, these are words coming from someone who he has been having sex with since before he was even in high school. And considering Korekiyo's primary personality trait is maintaining a sense of composure, we can assume this is reflective of a very real way she spoke with him. And I don't know, there's just something really upsetting about it when Korekiyo is having these massive meltdowns where he's sweating and shaking and screaming and can barely make a comprehensible sentence, and the second his sister tells him to pull himself together, he does so immediately. Even if it's not really his sister, it's disturbing that this is what he does when he's performing their dynamic, as if his most comfortable way of calming down is being commanded to, if he even knows any other way. And even outside of the trial, he wears the outfit she decided to make for him and pursues a field that she encouraged his interest in. Her influence is overwhelming in everything he does, and the fact he so strongly believes himself to need her that he's convinced himself her ghost is possessing his body is just so deeply sad. He can't even tell how deep into the rabbit hole he's sunk. He believes he's happy, and yet his life is so marred in misery. And the thing about all of this that has been eating my brain alive is that this reading doesn't really exist. I mean, I consider any reading that is supported with evidence from the text without contradicting the content to be a legitimate reading, but I would still call it an inaccurate reading because it contradicts the framing. The game only ever frames Korekiyo as a bad person and someone to be afraid of with no sympathetic qualities. My argument in this video isn't that there's this secret side to this character that the developers don't want you to know about and I only realized it because I have an IQ of 300. Rather, I'm arguing that there's a lot of content that the framing doesn't support, leaving the two in conflict, and yet neither the writers nor the fanbase at large know it because when content and framing are in conflict, framing almost always wins out because it's way harder to argue with or even notice. The framing of Korekiyo's character is, as a whole, a representation of one of V3's biggest writing issues, if not its biggest issue, and that is that the writing is incurious. The true reason Korekiyo is irredeemable, even when compared with others of his type, is because the writing lacks the ability to question itself. When I first began to write scripts for this video, I will admit I was willing to write off V3's character writing wholesale. I was willing to say almost everyone was written poorly, almost no one had an arc, and the characters were bare bones, but this isn't true. I think my hatred for the ending simply made me retroactively consider all the characters pointless and recolored my memory. However, I do think it's true that this game is not willing to interrogate these characters or ask questions about their stories. It's all taken at face value, and I think it's why people accuse this game of being written in contempt of the franchise or its fanbase, because incuriosity can look like carelessness from a certain angle. Kokichi's ultimate goals with his lying are pretty obvious, but what exactly motivates him to adopt this persona and use it all the time? Doesn't matter, it's just who he is. Is it possible Kaito's headstrong beliefs can sometimes produce unhelpful or even actively detrimental rhetoric, such as thinking Ryoma is a coward for expressing a desire to die? Well, if it is, we aren't going to think about it too hard. Kurumi's a very servile person, but what happened in her life that motivated her to be this way? Doesn't matter, it's just who she is. Is Anji even an accurate depiction of any Polynesian culture? According to a professor I emailed to ask exactly this, probably not. She seems to be built out of stereotypes more than anything. Maybe we could handwave it away by saying she's moved around a lot, so she has an unusual collection of beliefs and culture. Why even bother? Why is Korekiyo irredeemable? Doesn't matter, it's just who he is. That's who he was written to be, and we won't question if there might be something to sympathize with in there. You know, every now and then I get recommended a YouTube video asking why people hate V3. I've never actually watched it, but whenever I see it, I ask myself that. For a long time, I said I hated V3. I still do, passionately, but that's complicated by the realization I also love it. And that's because there's all these blocks laid out, but they're never used to build to something greater, and that's because the kids are just satisfied with looking at the blocks. I hate this game because it's hours of incurious character writing spiced up by progressively less interesting and more unbelievable bouts of absurdity. I'm sure people will argue that what I'm calling incuriosity is intentional. The characters' narratives are taken at face value because this is the 53rd season of a long-standing reality show, and the characters are deliberately written to reflect the disdain and dispassion the in-universe writers and showrunners have. However, it doesn't matter. Whether this incuriosity is deliberate or not, we only ever see the end result, so all we see, no matter what, is incuriosity. If this was the move they wanted to go with, then hints to this should exist throughout the text. What if the characters occasionally broke character when a gap in their backstory is hit, or maybe they express exasperation or confusion at their own storylines? That's only a few suggestions. There's a lot of ways this could have been done better if this was truly their intention. So, where do we even go from here now that I've said all this? I suppose the moral of the story is not to take a narrative's framing at face value. Most of the time, you will agree with a work's framing, and that's what everyone does. Nothing wrong with that. My goal isn't to encourage you to be a contrarian for the sake of it. But sometimes you will be confused or distressed when engaging with a piece of media, and if that happens, ask yourself where that feeling is coming from. Wonder if there's a question that isn't being asked. Always be curious. And also, justice for Korekiyo!